Right. Good evening, all participants. On the occasion of World Town Planning Day, we at Pune Center, that is ITPI MRC Pune Center at Pune, we have arranged this webinar, a lecture by eminent planner, Professor Sanjeev Vidyarthi from Chicago, that is University of Illinois. Without much wasting time, I request our convener for Pune Center, Sri Rajendra Pawar, to welcome all. And then we will have an introduction of our guest speaker, and then he will deliver his talk. And by 8:15 we have to finish because he has to go for another meeting also. So he will speak for at least 40 to 50 minutes, and then we will have a question answers, and then we will end program at 8:15. Over to Rajendra Pawar, sir.
Good evening all. I am Rajendra Pawar, convener Pune Center. Today is the World Town Planning Day, and this opportunity we shared with all the participants that arranging the lectures on WhatsApp with the planning field. Reflection on World Town Planning Day. I welcome all the participants for participating in this event, and you definitely enjoy this event with the technical knowledge of our respected dignitaries. Rao sir.
Thank you, Pawar sir. Isha will introduce now our guest speaker, Professor Sanjeev, in shortly. Isha, please. Isha is our faculty and also my PhD student.
Yes, thank you, sir. A very good evening to everyone, and best wishes to everyone on the occasion of the World Town Planning Day. We are really honored to have Dr. Sanjeev Vidyarthi sir with us today. A brief introduction. Dr. Sanjeev Vidyarthi sir is a professor of urban planning and policy. He's a senior fellow of the Great Cities Institute and the founding director of the Masters in City Design program at the University of Illinois, Chicago. He, sir, is a leading scholar of city planning in contemporary India and has authored and co-authored 5 books and numerous essays which have been published in leading academic journals. Dr. Sanjeev works with progressive scholars and eminent personalities and practitioners worldwide. So a warm welcome to you, sir. Thank you so much for joining us today. Over to you, sir.
Right. Thank you, Isha. Now, Professor Sanjeev will deliver his talk. Yes, sir. Please go ahead. Sir, your mic is off.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can you hear me fine now?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So I would like to begin by thanking Pratapji for inviting me to come and speak to you. And I would like to thank Isha for a nice introduction. And I would like to thank the organizing committee of the Pune Center for thinking of organizing an event on World Town Planning Day. Professionally, it's an important day for us as we celebrate our professional community and the many accomplishments we have had together as a collaborative of like-minded professionals. It's also a pleasure to speak to the Pune chapter because you are one of the more, in my understanding, the state of Maharashtra and the sub-chapters of Mumbai and Pune especially are some of the more prominent venues where action happens. So Pradeep Kapoor Sahab, I'm not sure if he's here. He might be thinking of Rajasthan chapter as perhaps an equally invigorated chapter, but nonetheless, I think of Pune chapter as a place where new ideas are deliberated, and it's one of the more active chapters in the ITPI hierarchy. Now, I first want to speak a little bit about the idea of celebrating one common day for the entire world, right? This is when we know the urbanization patterns are different, cities look and feel different in different parts of the world. There are different sorts of histories and social forces that shape places in different continents. Then why have one singular World Town Planning Day? The idea sort of goes to this notion that despite the many differences, despite huge number of differences, essentially the idea of urban has few things in common. It's also a hallmark of practitioners, especially who are trained professionally. So when I think of professionally trained practitioners, I'm thinking of doctors and lawyers and chartered accountants, architects, and also scientists in many ways. Professional planners sort of fall within the same realm of professionally trained practitioners who share a common knowledge, a common body of precedents, previous examples. And that's how the professionals are able to practice in different parts of the world. An Indian doctor, for example, can work in the US. A scientist from another part of the world can work in another part because we share common knowledges, right? So this idea of professionals having a common body of knowledge. Local differences are important, but so are these sort of almost universal knowledges that enable professional practitioners to move across borders. These could be physical borders, political borders, but also intellectual borders, and examine and study and work in different settings because we share a common core knowledge. And that common core knowledge is in my understanding, a major reason for celebrating a World Town Planning Day that sort of celebrates the common accomplishments, similar concerns. What do planners want, for example, in China, compared to what do planners want to accomplish in India? And let's say European Union, three very different contexts with very different political systems, with very different social dynamic, with a very different mode of economic organization. But there is a common concern for the planners in these three different contexts, and which is, in my understanding, creating a better quality of city life for everyone, right? This is what planners want. Similarly, doctors want a better quality of physical health for everyone. And that's sort of the common core that binds the work we do across different continents. So I was happy to see that the American Planning Association, which is the equivalent of ITPI, not really equivalent of ITPI because API is only sort of the professional body, whereas we have a different body for planning scholars called ACSP. So American Collegiate Schools of Planning. In India, both the functions are combined together in ITPI. So ITPI is much more powerful in the sense that it combines both the academic field as well as the practice field. But the APA recognizes the World Town Planning Day as well, and calls for the fact that it's celebrated in 4 continents in 30 different countries officially. I was pleasantly surprised to see this. So the World Town Planning Day, to my mind, sort of both, provides us a venue to celebrate our professional identity and the accomplishment over past 60 or 70 years together. And as we know, planning has boomed in the post-war period. So after 1950s, at the end of the Second War, planning both as a discipline and as a practice where we actually do things on ground has blossomed in different parts of the world. So congratulations to all of us for reaching another milestone. I want to shift gears a little bit now and want to talk about what's sort of the imagination? Where do we stand at this point of time in the year 2021? This is important to my mind. Taking stock, the way I think of is, सबसे पहले हम ये figure out करें कि हम कहाँ खड़े हैं, right? Where do we stand? Once we sort of know, and planners do it well, knowing where we stand helps us imagine the future, right? So knowing the context of your present sort of helps you speculate about possible scenarios in future. That's what most of planning deals with. We are sort of a future-oriented profession. हम भविष्य की तरफ देख के बात करते हैं. Past is sort of important for us. The present helps us to imagine what the future might look like. So I want to take a few minutes talking about where we stand today in year 2021 and using the advantage of gaining from the perspective both in India, where I do most of my research. I am a frequent traveler between India and US, and it helps that Chicago and Delhi are connected via a direct flight of Air India. Every year I'm in India 2, 3, 4 months at different points in time, sort of studying the changes both within the planning literature and actual physical planning on ground, using a comparative inside-outside perspective. So the second perspective I want to draw in from is what's happening in the US in terms of planning. And I think in my mind, comparing these two will sort of give us a more robust understanding of how our discipline today stands, both internally as well as externally. One of the bigger insights about planning for places is that the larger political and economical context always shape the planning that happens in a place. हम जहां पर भी plans बना रहे हो या planning कर रहे हो, जो larger social और economic और political context होता है, वो shape करता है कि हम किस तरीके के plans बनाते हैं. A good example is the kind of planning that happens in China. It's very state-centered, very top-down, and driven. It's backed by state power. Very different approach in the United States, where the actual power to plan is delegated to the local governments. The federal government sort of tries to control it through funding mechanism. The state governments usually hand it over, right, to local governments to do the planning. And it's a federal structure, just like as in India. So the strength of this system is that if the local governments are not doing their function, the state steps in. And if the state is not doing it, the federal might step in. So this sort of a loose, flexible structure creates an institutional arrangement where there is room for innovation, and it happens at different levels. Indian system is somewhere, one could argue, is in between. We have a strong state-supported planning institutional arrangement in place, where both the central government increasingly now funds urban development directly via CSS, centrally sponsored schemes like JNNURM and smart cities. So central government directly sends money to local places. States have the control over how actual planning happens in terms of both administrative control via deputation of officers and so on and so forth, but also in terms of the legal arrangement where the power to do spatial planning and urban development rests at the state level. That does not mean that innovation in India does not happen using the federal structure. It does happen. Some states do much better than other states, as we know. And then even within states, some cities tend to do better than other places do. So the argument remains that the larger social and political context shapes the way planning happens in places. A good example would be, let's go back to the Indian example. जब हमारा political and social context change हो जाता है, तो planning उसके साथ change हो जाती है. Planning arguably before liberalization of economy in early 1990s was very different than the planning practiced in India after 1990s. Planning may change हो गया because the larger political and economic context changed. right? This is you when you step back and when you start look at the longer trajectory. Similarly, in the US, planning has changed at least 3 times in the 20th century. The planning in the US was very physically oriented until about 1970s. The building of public housing projects and and the interstate highways through the city sort of created all sort of issues, and then planning in the US sort of moved away from physical planning and became more community and economic development oriented planning. In the last couple decades, it's been argued that planning in the US is changing again. And this time it is being more nuanced and more integrative towards environmental issues. For the current time, and that stands out, that the planning today responds to the 2 major factors that shape planning, both in the US and in India, I would argue. One is environmental issues. As climate change sort of begins to unfold with different sort of extreme climate events in different parts of the world. The Chennai flood yesterday is a good example of this. And the flood, the way urban environmentalists think of it, is one, excessive rainfall in short period of time, and second, inability of that particular geography to deal with that water. If there were more open spaces in Chennai, for example, or Mumbai, if the drainage paths were not impeded, the water would go away and there would not be a flood. So the situation of flood depends upon the receiving geography as much as on the amount of rainfall that falls. That we can't control, but we can control how the geography is laid out so the water can go away. So increasing attention towards ideas like green infrastructure. Green infrastructure is essentially the idea that we can use open and green spaces of a city for a variety of purposes, like flood mitigation. If a city has, for example, large amount of open areas and we can divert the rainwater there, the earth would act as sponge and some of that water would naturally be drained into the ground, rather than trying to create an urban infrastructure, a physical infrastructure to drain that water out using drainage and culverts. For example, the city of Chicago spent almost $17 billion to try create a rainwater system where excess rainfall is drained from the central city. And this project took something like a couple of decades to be built. And what was the result? It failed miserably. And the city hall sort of figured out that we cannot. It is virtually impossible to design and build a physical infrastructure to take the rainwater out of the city, especially during extreme rainy events. And that's what climate change does, that it creates these extreme events of excessive heat or excessive rainfall, excessive snow, right? Precipitation of different kinds, dryness, so that wildfires propagate. So these extreme events, it's very difficult. So how do we do it? We use green infrastructure. That's where the current status of the profession is, that we leave open spaces. The cities need to be a combination. So it sort of calls for revisiting our ideas about land use and the use of land in the sense that an adequate amount, and that what's that adequate amount is open to different geographies and localities and patterns of living in different places, but adequate amount of space to be left in urban areas so that the rainwater can be tackled there rather than trying to collect it in central locations and transport it away. Similarly, the idea of blue infrastructure is gaining ground. The idea of blue infrastructure is similar to the green infrastructure in the sense that we say, hey, the natural drainage of an area of the larger watershed is critically important. Now, this idea sort of goes back in many ways to the notion of regional planning, especially as conceptualized in the early years with the Regional Planning Association of America, and the work of Patrick Geddes and Louis Mumford, sort of thinking of urban areas not via political jurisdictions. And that's important, but all in terms of environmental regions. So that is the scale that becomes increasingly clear in this age of climate change, that environmental region, which is part of a larger watershed, perhaps is the best unit for doing planning, and not political jurisdiction that, hey, this is the PMC boundary and this is the development, this is the MIDC boundary, and each jurisdiction. Political jurisdictions are important for administrative efficiency and organization of bureaucratic machinery, but not really for doing environmental planning kind of work, because we know, when a good example people talk about is when the nuclear radiation came from Chernobyl in Europe, it did not stop at the border and produce a passport. It just comes through. Similarly, the pollution between India and Pakistan, it does not stop at the Wagah border, right? The pollution, the air, the water, the larger natural systems sort of cut through our political jurisdiction. So environmental regions, at this point in time, we think that watersheds are the best planning units. And that sort of provides impetus to the idea of blue infrastructure. So one of the way currently APA sort of recommends that we sort of do planning work is, if we're thinking through, let's say, GIS or a modeling kind of a template, the first thing you do is you map an existing urban area, and then you take away, right? You remove or you freeze all the green and blue land uses. So all green, natural forest preserves, open spaces, parks, reserve forests, whatever is green should not be touched. And whatever is blue, that means all the water bodies and water channels should not be touched. India is similar. I think so if this is what's happening in the US, I think India is not far behind. We are pretty close to it in terms, some of it comes from legal strictures. For example, Supreme Court of India has said that, you know, water bodies should be clear of encroachments. Green open spaces in urban areas should be clear of encroachments. So similar idea that we keep these two open because they are fundamental to the way we conceptualize planning work in this age of climate change. So one is climate change related things that are shaping planning today. And the second is the idea of social equity and justice. जिसको हम इंडिया में सामाजिक न्याय कहते हैं. This is, you know, the social. So social on one hand and environmental on the second hand. Why social? Social has become, as you might have seen on TV, in the US, we have a very fraught political culture at this point in time, where there is contestation of all the kinds, blacks and whites, immigrants versus residents, Republicans versus Democrats. It's a very contentious time, and as you know, as societies go through these moments of churning, that work shapes planning in fundamental ways. So it's what planning and within the planning discipline, there is an internal churning that motivates planners to pay questions to these larger structural, systemic kind of apparatus that discriminates against certain populations in powerful ways. So उसको हम कैसे revisit करें, and उसको हम planning किस तरीके से करें ताकि these historical errors and these historical systemic ideas sort of move away. So social and environmental are the two dimensions, right, that are shaping planning currently. Just 30-40 years ago in India, the two driving forces, the largest driving forces in my understanding and in my reading of Indian planning, one was the idea of nation building. Azadi ke turant baad we wanted to build the idea has come back as Atmanirbhar Bharat, but this was essentially the purpose of planning as conceptualized in 1950s and 60s. And if Meshram Saab is attending, he would know this well. was the idea, एक तरफ हम nation building करना चाहते थे, and दूसरी तरफ the idea of planning was to move a country which had been drained of its resources in the colonial times, right? A poor, impoverished country to a better quality of life for all residents. So nation building हम करना चाहते थे और दूसरी तरफ economic development करना चाहते थे. These two frames, these two dimensions, shaped the planning work in Indian planning from 1950s to arguably 1990s. From 1990s, we've sort of shifted towards a more inclusive, ताकि सिर्फ सरकार के ऊपर जिम्मेदारी नहीं रहे, but other players in the planning field, inviting the private sector, inviting residents, inviting entrepreneurs, inviting foreign direct investment. So the government sort of opened up the planning field for other actors, in resident welfare associations, and so on and so forth. Now that is shifting again. The compass at this point in time, increasingly, sometimes we know some actors work more slowly than others. Sometimes the politics of the place takes time, but the longer trend in my imagination in both the places is increasingly clear. Where on the one hand, we are seeing this shift in priorities, both because of climate change, and the second is emergent questions of social justice. That never really went away, but are gaining prominence increasingly as the contestation increases. So what we need is actually unifiers, people who can sort of bridge together these gaps and practice the kind of planning which is more inclusive and which sort of addresses some of these issues. I'll see if I can share a few slides. I hope you can see these images. Huh, Pratap? Good. So I just want to sort of walk through these 4 or 5 slides that sort of frame my larger understanding of how these changes are important. India is a special case in many ways in the world that it's a unique. We stand at a very unique and interesting point in time. This is a graphic that sort of shows the world population growth through the known human history. As you would see, that for a long period of time, the evolution of modern humans, Homo sapiens walking on 2 feet, sort of goes back almost half a million years. So the earliest humans, as we know, emerged in the Horn of Africa, which is the modern day Ethiopia and Somalia and Kenya and parts of Uganda, about 5 lakh saal pehle. But the human population remained fairly stable, 200 to 300 million people. And a large part of that population lived in India. So India is one of the earliest places to where humans move from the Horn of Africa and settle down. Why? One is the question of geography. It is well connected. The second is the question of arable land. India has one of the most productive landscapes in the world, where we can grow pretty much everything and all around the year. So India is one of the earlier places to sort of both have human population and urbanize. But the fact remains that the world population remains constant for 200 to 300 million. About 200 to 300 million people spread over the entire world for most of the time. It's only in last 400 or 500 years that suddenly we as a species, Manav Jati, took over, right? We blossomed And you see from 200-300 million to 8 billion in about 500, 600, 700 years. And that happened on the back of various things, including industrialization, increase in agriculture productivity, the shift towards a scientific way of thinking, and most importantly, the inventions done in public health. In India, for example, in the 1951 census that you see, the median age of Indians living in rural areas was 27 years for the male population. 27 average age in 1951. And that is, close to late 67, 68 years in 2011. So we did very well via vaccinations, via all sort of medication. We took care of most of our adversaries. So imagine if you were living 600-700 years ago on planet Earth, you would be scared of, if you went out of your home at night, there would be darkness and tigers and elephants and all sort of. If you went out in the ocean, there were sharks. If you were at home, all sort of viruses and bacteria and pathogens could kill you. Human beings very successful in that we have tamed, and our population has blossomed. Now, this growth in population is also accompanied by rising incomes. This is a map that sort of charts human income over time, over last 2,000 years. And as you see in this, towards the bottom, despite of whatever people who like to read the history romantically say, we have been a poor people. I mean, when I say we, I mean people everywhere in the world. Most of us have historically been poor. We have not been very prosperous. As this chart shows, the bottom are average income, GDP per capita, but sort of, towards the bottom, about $400 to $500. And then it begins to rise. It is charting here in the United States, but this is sort of the world population. And then you see, as our population has increased after in industrial revolution, especially, the GDP per capita booms. So it's not only humans increasing in numbers, it's also becoming more prosperous. Within India also, we can sort of see, since independence, we as a society and as a country, also at the household and individual level, have become more prosperous relative to where we were at that point in time. This is the third map that sort of informs my understanding of how the world stands today. This is a map produced by plotting only the air routes. So someone took a flight chart map of the world and connected all the dots where the flights are traveling from one point to another. There is no baseline. There is no background to this map. It's only the flight paths as they connect different cities. And you can see that Europe still, at some level, Europe and eastern seaboard of the United States, this sort of transatlantic, is still sort of the core where the maximum air travel takes place. Though India is coming up, and so are other parts of Asia. But this map nonetheless shows us the interconnectedness of the world and how certain geographies still remain privileged within that geography. This is an interesting map, and I'm sure all of you are very familiar with this, that this is a map of the world that shows human density, where humans live. The lighter colors are where there is less number of people, and the darker color means there are more number of people. So India is one of the densest places, and that requires, for us as planners, paying even more attention to the climate and the social issues that are coming onto the main stage. And then this is a map that shows the climate risk index. It has, and India, as you see, and our geography in general, geography of South Asia, is one of the more vulnerable geographies facing the brunt of climate change as it would happen. So increasing population, increasing prosperity, but sort of along with increasing climate risk. And that sort of, this is a map that sort of some of the largest cities in the world. And as we see it, India houses, especially along the Ganges, from Calcutta to almost Lahore, or maybe even Peshawar, is a continuous belt of urbanization. And so along the Western Ghats and the peninsula from Bangalore, Hyderabad, and the coast of Kerala. So this is sort of the moment. I think these 6 or 7 graphics, and that's what I like about them, they encapsulate this moment where we stand today in the year 2021. With all these changes going on, as we see as planners, both on this side of the world as well as on the Indian side of the world. So with that, I would like to stop, congratulate everyone again, and reiterate the importance of work planners do. I do not see the glass half full. I do not see the glass half empty. I see the glass half full, which means I am optimistic by nature. And planners, I believe, are optimistic people because we are future oriented. And much, though it is easy to critique, and critique is important in the scientific model, because if we do not critique, we do not make progress. One of the more fundamental pillars of scientific knowledge is we begin by critiquing ki galat kya hai. That's how we sort of point out the gaps. And then in an ideal world, we create solutions and we create fixes and we improvise to address those gaps. And that's how humans make progress. So the next generation need to be doing better than the previous one, and that's how humans make progress. So this idea gives me hope, because I see young Indians doing better, becoming more confident, more in numbers, and hopefully that's the way that this would pan out in future, and some of these emergent issues would sort of be addressed in a more appropriate manner by the next generation of planners. With that, I would like to open it for questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Well, you have taken the journey from starting from the community social aspect, then the blue and green spaces, importance of green spaces, then the evolution, how does evolution, and then the urbanization. These 4 different aspects you have touched. Very nice, sir. We will open up now. Participant, you can just post it on chat box so that I can pose your questions to Professor Sanjeev.
Hello, sir. May I ask?
Yeah.
Hello, myself.
Yes, Yogesh, please go ahead.
Sir, myself, Yogesh. Yeah. Sir, it was a very nice lecture. I am myself Yogesh, assistant professor in planning. Okay. So I have one question regarding whatever you explained regarding projecting. We are planning for future, and then we take the reference from past. But see, the things no one thought 2 years back regarding this COVID and big setback which we have. So what such thing happens several times in 100 years back also it happened, and during the era. How to look towards it and how to move ahead, because now the situation 100 years back was different than what we have today. We have advanced technology, but still this has taught us a lesson that huge big urbanization is also not the solution. We need to focus on the local things. So how to look forward towards it? Can you please enlighten upon this?
Yes. Yeah, that's a great question, Yogesh. And this is something. One thing that is important for us to keep in mind that as planners, we are always trying to predict and anticipate what might happen in future. The planning activity, hum usko urban, we try to make urban plans, but think of planning as simple planning as an activity. Humans hamesha planning karte hain. This is one of the things that has become increasingly clear. Households, कोई घर में जो गृहस्थ होता है वो प्लानिंग करता है कि कल को मैं रिटायर होऊंगा तो मेरी क्या, how would I, retirement planning क्या होगी, मैरिज के लिए प्लानिंग करते हैं, घर बनाने के लिए प्लानिंग करते हैं, सोसाइटीज प्लान करती है कि कल को girl education is a great example in India. The whole society planned, and within 2 generations, my grandmother was perhaps the first one in many, many generations to go to school. But my daughter has caught up, and so is true for the women in India in general, that very quickly, right? So society level planning for girl education, national level planning for defense of India. So different levels पे हम planning करते हैं. लेकिन इन सारी planning में जो मूल point होता है वो ये होता है कि we are trying, when we are making a plan, we trying to imagine कि कल क्या हो सकता है, and how do we plan for what might happen. और retirement के बाद अगर ऐसा हुआ तो मैं क्या करूँगा, तो I should have some cash. ऐसा हुआ तो क्या होगा, I should have my own house, right? So we trying to imagine कि क्या होगा और उसके लिए हम कैसे plan. Now, this is one hand. The second hand is that future is impossible to predict. अब कल की छोड़ो, हमें ये नहीं पता 1 घंटे बाद क्या होगा, right? I mean, that's the thing with future. So on one hand, we're trying to imagine and adapt for future, and the second is we do not really know what might happen in future. So planning is one of the few disciplines, that sort of does this work. Doctors are not trying to imagine and predict what might happen tomorrow. Doctors are concerned with what's happening now. Same is true for most of the discipline, lawyers, scientists. No, planners are one of the few. The very founding of discipline is about anticipating and predicting what might happen tomorrow on one hand, and the second is how do we prepare for it. Our plans are essentially, if you look at our plans from this perspective, that's what the plans are trying to do. All the master plans try to imagine 15 saal baad kya. You are right, and you are right, because within 2 years the situation changes, and that's why many of our plans do not work. Most parts of the plan would work, but many plans of the part would not work because the situation has changed. The context has changed. Nobody could have imagined 10 years ago that everyone would have a smartphone, right? Technology changes, society changes, larger changes. So one way people think of addressing now I'll come to the question directly, what Yogesh asked. One of the ways, ऐसा नहीं था कि COVID के लिए US में plan नहीं था. So this was one of the first things I did was once this sort of pandemic began to revolt, I went to CDC website and they had a plan. And it was a fantastic plan. But that plan was not followed. Why it was not followed? Because the administration of the day, the Trump presidency, did not really believe that we need to tackle it at the federal level. So we had a beautiful, clearly identified, made plan, but it sat on the shelf and nobody followed it. So the plan tha. That means someone imagined, right? This is the idea of plans is plans offer advice. What we are doing as planners when we make a plan is we offer advice to the government of the day, to the people of the city, and so on and so forth. So the plan existed. Following the plan is a different thing. One of the way we think of planning today is sort of we are scenario plan. That when we are making plans for places, we sort of think what possible scenarios might pan out, and disaster is usually one of the scenarios. Could anyone predict that it would happen like this? No, but we had advisories from WHO. I mean, if you talk to people in public health, they would say 8 billion people and many living in very third world circumstance. And many communities without access to fresh water or clean surrounding. Remember, planning as a profession was born with 2. We were three professions that were born together in the industrial city: public health, social work, and urban planning. The 3 professions were born exactly around the same time, given that terrible condition in the industrial city. In the Western world as a modern discipline, right? I mean, though we have been making cities for a long time. So yes, scenario planning could help us imagine those kind of scenarios. There was a plan, it did not get implemented. What's the lesson for tomorrow? That we should have plans ready for more situations like this, and a flexible planning approach that happens via scenario planning. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, sir. We have another question from Tushar Sathe from MIDC. Due to socio-economical, environmental, and technological changes over a time, which aspect has to be addressed in preparation of spatial plan? Is there any need to address these aspects in prevailing Town Planning Act 2?
Have to be addressed in the preparation. This is again, Tushar, it's an excellent question. My sense of my reading of Indian planning says that, you know, the idea of having a sort of a comprehensive plan is a good one. Comprehensive in the sense that we try to study different aspects of that place. Social, economical, cultural, you know, as many. But we do not try to be prescriptive, right? So comprehensive in reading, but not comprehensive in prediction. No, it is beyond human imagination to try and shape every aspect of a city's spatial development. Impossible. Kar hi nahi sakte. Too many people, too many changing dimensions, too much. But we can try comprehensively study so that the comprehensive plan becomes a go-to place, sort of an encyclopedia of a city. So comprehensive reading, fantastic. Comprehensive changes, not so much. So maybe a comprehensive plan at the city scale, but more action-oriented plan at the local scales. You know, just the size is so big in India, and I think India is a special case, as I mentioned early on. The city of Chicago, जिसको हम सोचते हैं बहुत great city है, बहुत बड़ी city है, right? I mean, people across the world. The population of the city of Chicago is 2.7 million, 27 lakh. That is, you know, what is 27 lakh in India? I mean, it does not even ring a bell. So 27 lakh, you know, maybe Western Pune is more than 27 lakh. It's 40 lakh, you know. I mean, you get the drift. So हमारा scale ही अलग है. हमें in India India really is the urban frontier. That's where the action is happening. That's where better work needs to happen for this planet, because you saw those maps, right? I mean, when we say India, that means we're talking about 20% of the world. And if we add China, we are 45% of the world. Half of the world lives in these two places. And if we include our sister countries, which are actually India only, you know, both geographically and socially and culturally, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal. This is, politically, they might be different countries, but geographically, environmentally, culturally, we sort of one land mass. So between India and China is within that little geography of the world, we have about half the population of the world. उस चीज में हम comprehensive solution future के लिए very difficult to plot. Comprehensive study, fantastic idea. Because we know urban phenomena are interrelated. Land use is related with transport, and transport is, हम जैसे ही सड़क बनाएंगे वहां land use automatic change जाएगा. आप अपने नक्शे में कुछ भी दिखला दे रहे हैं, people would themselves sort of shape that land use, and that's fine. You know, there is a cultural pattern to it, but that land use is related with transport, and transport is related to economic development, because that's where the industry would go, and economic development is related to neighborhood planning, because that's where neighborhoods would be formed, and that is related with environmental rights. So stuff is related within urban systems, that we know well, and we cannot study them in isolation. We need a comprehensive study. So until then, fantastic idea. Now, the data is changing all the time. Places are changing, people are changing, the politics is changing, right? But we have a snapshot reading. The comprehensive study is a snapshot across the dimension of time. That we do well. Now, can we use this to make comprehensive changes? I'm not so sure. No. We can make changes at local level, working with local communities. That's where the current planning wisdom stands. So hopefully that answers your question.
Great, sir. Great, sir. Another question from Avinash Patil, who is a director at Maharashtra State, Director of Town Planning. What potential does India has in terms of spatial planning compared to other countries?
incredible. It's what, I mean, in my understanding, India really stands at the cusp of a great urbanizing movement. And this sort of comes clear. हर policy level पर अगर आप देखें तो भारत सरकार अब clearly बात करती है. आज से 20 साल पहले, I mean, I can sort of perhaps the best example I can think of Rajasthan is because I know that place better than other states in India, is 20 साल पहले कोई urban development and housing portfolio को पूछता ही नहीं था. You know, the leading politicians wanted to be PWD or irrigation minister. Today, UDH is the #1 portfolio committed at various scales. Why? Because the government of India and the state governments in India realize the power and the importance of UDH. It is for everyone to see. And then on the other hand, Indian cities are some of the hardest places to live in the world. The everyday life, you know, whether it's air pollution, water pollution, traffic issues, all of us face it, and we understand it better than most common people. So isse acha ek taraf opportunity hai aur dusri taraf issue hai, right? So there is a push and a pull factor. As planners, I think this is a fantastic time because cutting edge work abhi India mein hi hona hai. And the way the Chinese are doing it very different. They have a very different political approach to it. They have a very different social structure to support it. They have a very different government machinery to do it. In India, we are much more inclusive and much more democratic than many parts of the world. And how would we do it? So I agree with Avinash Saab. This is a good time for Indian planners. Our institutional foundations are strong. This is one thing that has to be said about ITPI. That despite many other shortcomings, few number of planners, not perhaps a very large community of planners across India, but what they've done very well in the last 30, 40 years is to create institutional structures across the length and breadth of the country, different states having statutory acts, the formation of planning directorates and town planning departments across the country, growing number of educational institutes, and then ITPI with its regional centers and sub-centers sort of comprising a geography, own offices, a strong institutional infrastructure across the country. Now, taking it forward is the big question. And I think this is the best Indian planners have had in a long time, since maybe 1960s and 70s, when planning received a lot of priority. But then we sort of went down in the 80s and 90s with the political churning. But now planning stands at a very prime and a very important juncture in its history in independent India.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Another question from Prahlad Padalikar. He's asking that can we not make it flexible, that is planning flexible in nature to blend with local functional requirement of the community in particular area? Yeah, of course.
No, I agree. This is, Prahlad, this is absolutely, that's the way it seems to do it. And I think most people and practitioners and policy makers agree to it. How would this happen is the big question. You know, agreement hai at the discussion level. Yes, we should do it at the working with local communities. How do you do it is the question. One way is the planners working as an activist. The second, and that's been tried, there is enough literature documenting it. The second is people themselves planning for it, you know, and that happens oftentimes. Communities themselves organize around important issues. For example, in Rajasthan, there are good examples now of rural communities, especially organizing themselves for catching and storing rainwater and using it throughout the year. You know, very community driven, sort of using local wisdom, very grassroots. Can we do it in urban areas? That's the question. Urban areas, especially in an urbanizing scenario, you know, we have our cities are still growing. So that means there is still rural migration and then metropolization, people from smaller cities moving into large cities. And very big and very complex, where there are all kinds of social, political upheaval going on. So how do we sort of scale that up? is the pressing question. There's no doubt that that's the way it should be happening. We should be a little more flexible with our plans, because if we make very concrete, very fixed plans, they do not work because the situation changes. The plan might be perfectly all right. The plan might be the clevermost or smartest. You know, some of the smartest plans sit on shelves because the situation changes. So वो plan का use नहीं. So flexible, yes. How at that urbanizing scale is the question.
Yeah, good, sir. Avinash is again asking for a suggestion that research area where Indian planners should go, and how does academic, that is education, is oriented towards a new planning.
Yeah. So this is a fantastic question. This is a question close to my heart. To sort of give my own example, I worked, I graduated, मी मुंबईला गेला होता अभ्यास करण्यासाठी आणि मी जेजेला बीआर्च केला. त्याच्या नंतर मी जयपूर.
That is great, sir.
I went to Jaipur. हा, मी काहीतरी.
So you have some connection with Maharashtra.
Yes. So, but I went and I practiced in Jaipur for 10-12 years. And I always wondered कि मैं ऐसे practice क्यों करता हूँ, मैं ऐसे building क्यों बनाता हूँ, मैं ऐसे घर क्यों बनाता हूँ, मैं neighborhood का plan ऐसे क्यों, where is these ideas coming from? And I miss the theory of it. So Indian planning practice, Indian architecture, Indian city planning, ये हमने theorize नहीं किया, इसको research की बहुत ज़्यादा आवश्यकता है. हमने क्यों नहीं किया theorize? Few reasons are clear. First, we just didn't have enough number of planners. A threshold, a critical mass चाहिए होता है. We are still a growing profession. Architects have done better than us. Engineers in India have done better than us in terms of multiplying. We still remain a small community, and that's how I and Pratapji met talking about research. Research is fundamental, and researching our own. मैं इतनी दूर आया अपने देश को study करते, right? I mean, because I realized at some level that much of the planning that was happening in India, or much of architecture, had its roots here. It is like living in 17th century Rajasthan, or अगर आप पढ़ना चाहते हैं संस्कृत तो आपको बनारस जाना पड़ेगा. Why? Because मूल उसका जो है वो कबीर जी भी बनारस में थे, right? I mean, there is a मूल of Sanskrit. It's only later in 17th, 18th century that places like Pune and Jaipur come up. That Jaipur is called Choti Kashi because the Maharajas of Jaipur, especially Savai Ram Singh Ji in the 18th century, promoted the scholarship of Sanskrit. And so did Peshwas in Pune, right? But these are regional centers that emerged later. But if you are in 13th century Rajasthan, तो आपको बनारस ही जाना पड़ता था, काशी जाना पड़ता था संस्कृत पढ़ने. Something like this. So I had to come this distance to study about my own country. But that's not true anymore. We have I read a PhD. I read these doctoral dissertations. I work with young Indian students both here as well in India. That research is something that is fundamental. We have to understand, we have to document, we have to illustrate, we have to empirically map, and we have to write. Why do we have to do this? So that the future generations can gain from that knowledge and carry that bank of knowledge further. That's how human societies progress. So आपका question बिल्कुल ठीक है. You touched a raw nerve in my heart, as you see, and that's the way it should be done. Absolutely.
Right. Deepali wanted to ask you, is predict, design, and provide approach for planning process now onward for systematic and logical urban planning?
Good question, Deepali. ये जो आपने जो बात कही है, certain kinds of planning के लिए बिल्कुल ठीक है. We are always, as I said, we are always trying to predict what might happen and then design to address that anticipated need, and then provide for those goods. So this kind of a systems-based model works well for certain things, like water supply, small towns. अगर एक छोटा शहर है, 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 हजार तक का, we can always do this kind of a comprehensive system-based planning. Smaller places, system planning though helps us think at larger scale environmental systems, but the scale is important. किस scale पे हम किस तरीके का plan बनाएं? रीजनल स्केल पर इस तरीके की चीज जो आप बात कर रही है वो मे बी वाटर सप्लाई. वी कैन predict water की क्या demand होगी. We can sort of look at our green and blue infrastructure, and then we can design a system which is sustainable, which is environmentally conscious, and then provide, right? So, लेकिन regional scale के ऊपर, if I want to do residential planning, I'm not sure whether this is the best model to do. So, किस scale पे किस तरीके का plan use करें? Like that varies. What you say works well at smaller scales, definitely.
Yeah. This is another question which they are talking about how other countries are handling unauthorized construction, because that's a phenomenon actually larger in Indian context.
Yes, yes. नहीं ये ठीक बिल्कुल Nilesh, this is a question many of us have struggled with. I think there are two ways to think of it. कुछ पहला तो ये है कि what we really mean by encroachment. You know, there's certain things that get classified as encroachment, but they might not be encroachments, but cultural phenomena, right? So encroachment की definition एक key है to answer this question, especially within Indian context. जैसे जयपुर का मैं आपको एक एग्जांपल दूं. जयपुर में जयपुर में जो मंदिर होते हैं वो कम्युनिटी खुद ही बना लेती है. अगर आप एक पार्क की जगह नेबरहुड में छोड़ेंगे तो आप थोड़े दिन में देखेंगे उसके अंदर एक मंदिर बन गया. इट्स यूजुअली पैट्रोनाइज्ड बाय द लोकल कम्युनिटी, पीपल हु लिव अराउंड. वही चंदा करके बना लेते हैं, फिर एक पुजारिया, फिर वो उसमें बिजली, पानी, टेलीफोन सब वो कम्युनिटी व्यवस्था करती है. इज इट नाउ it's not a temple as an historical temple. It's more like a community center because उसके अंदर फिर नवरात्रि भी वही celebrate होती है. Maybe there is a homeopathy doctor that shows up. Maybe there is coaching classes. Maybe that's where people meet and talk, and different kinds of people meet at different points in time. Now, would I like to call it an encroachment? I'm not sure. मेरे हिसाब से वो cultural phenomena है. That's how people have lived in that part of the world, and that's how that sort of makes up a cultural place for them. Vis-a-vis an encroachment where a rich person encroaches on a land, or where a marginalized location, let's say Nale ka, river bank is taken over by a community that wants to be proximate to the work. It's a very different kind of an encroachment. So your question can go either way. There are certain kind of encroachments we really don't want. For example, people living on marginalized location as floodplains. क्योंकि जब भी वो flood आएगा तो that would be a human disaster, and we see it all the time, right? That kind of encroachment, not a good idea. Encroachment in forest lands and green open spaces of the city, not a good idea, as we just talked about green infrastructure and importance of open spaces. Encroachment of rich people, not a good idea. We should not tolerate it. But these local appropriations, not encroachments, appropriation, temple building, conversion of houses into shops along major arterial roads. वो हमें पता है कि इंडिया में जहां भी major road होती है, historically there is commercial land use next to it, right? I mean, it's a historical phenomenon. Romans called it insula, this building typology where there's commercial on the ground floor and residential on the upper floor. That building typology goes back 2000 years. And driven by Anglo-Saxon models, we said, nah, हम तो ये residential होगा या institutional होगा. We tried it and we succeeded in some spots, but not in many spots. That kind of encroachment, I think we need to be a little more inclusive of our local cultural patterns and try accommodate. And that's beginning to happen in India. Many Indian recent urban plans sort of accommodate mixed land uses. So encroachment is a good question, but at what stage and how we define it would sort of shape what gets counted as encroachment or not.
Yeah, that's good. Shende sir wanted to ask you about the master plan in USA. What is the time period and in which it is prepared, and then there is any mechanism for review in midway between implementation?
Yeah, yes. No, excellent question, Shinisa. Sir, master plans in the US are sort of, they are not statutory documents. So the difference between master plans in Indian context and the US context, the first is master plans in the US are not statutory documents. इसका मतलब उसको master plan बनाते हैं because most states have enabling act that require local governments to make master plans. Usually the horizon of 15 to 20 years. Some states have 15 years, many states have 20 years. But they are sort of reference documents. The legal, the statutory document is zoning, जिसको अपन land use कहते हैं, कि इस जगह पर इस तरीके का land use हो सकता है, single family residential, multi-family residential, institutional, industrial. वो zoning उसको govern करती है. Zoning is the statutory document which has the backing of law and which you have to follow. Master plan is required 15 to 20 years, but it's mostly as a reference document. Review, yes, it's usually updated 10 to 15, usually there would be a midterm review and they would update it, but it's sort of more as a guiding document that in the future, this is the kind of development we want, this is the kind of changes we want to see. So that's a major difference between the two concepts.
Right. Thank you, sir. Almost 10 minutes past 8. I know you told me that you have to go at 15. That is 2015. But thank you. You have touched many aspects of planning. In fact, the planning itself is a complex IC, and it is this complexity, planner try to address with different instrument, but always there will be challenge for that, and always this challenging profession is there. And Sanjeev sir, you have done a great job. We will come back at some point because in Maharashtra, I think on behalf of Avinash Patil sir, we had some group formation where we are taking some experts, for the deliberation, to give some kind of a orientation for the planning system. In fact, today itself, I wanted to share a news that this COP26 Leadership Award, Regional Leadership Award, is only one of the states that in Maharashtra has got selected for that COP26 climate action. And today I read this news. Is only one of the state from India which own this under 2 coalition climate action award. So in a way, actually Maharashtra always try to be progressive and always try to make some experimentation. So thank you, Sanjeev sir, for excellent talk. And I think is anybody there from Pawar sir? Okay. So on behalf of this ITPI-Pune Center, Maharashtra Regional Chapter, I thank you all participants and Professor Sanjeev for very excellent talk. And in fact, yeah.
Well done, Professor Ravar. Well done, Professor Ravar.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. So thank you, Professor Sanjeev. We will now close this program. I will again trouble you at some point of time. Please bear with me. But definitely we wanted to utilize your expertise, for planning purpose in Maharashtra. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
sir.
you, everyone.
Thank you, participants. Thank you, Shende sir and all, Kop Sahib and all. Thank you.